Hey everyone, and welcome back to LV Scary Stories. Most of the story submissions I receive from my other channel, which is in my native language, come from California and Minnesota. My small community is mostly from these two states. In this video, I'll be sharing 4 chilling stories from Minnesota. When we first arrived in the United States, we were poor and lived in tougher neighborhoods before working hard to move into better areas. That's why haunted house stories are so common in our community. They reflect both our struggles and the lingering echoes of the past. I hope you enjoy these true spine-tingling tales, submitted by my amazing audience. Story number 1. When I was a little boy, my mother and father broke up, and they split us kids up. My mother kept my 2 sisters, while my father took me. We separated the traditional way, which usually meant that daughters stayed with the mother. Later, my father remarried a woman who had 2 kids, and we moved into a small house near Monarch Highway in St. Paul, Minnesota. The house had 3 bedrooms. My father and stepmother shared one room, my 2 stepbrothers shared another, and I shared the 3rd room with my grandma. I was a troublesome kid, and since I was older than my 2 stepbrothers, I would sometimes make them cry and get in trouble with my father. My stepmother didn't say much at first, but as time passed, she started being mean to me. Whenever one of my stepbrothers cried, whether it was my fault or not, I always got blamed. To escape, I'd run to my grandma. She would lecture my father, saying things like, "Why are you so hard on your only son? You buy nice clothes and things for other people's kids, but you don't do that for your own son. When you were little, your father and I never treated you like this." My grandma loved me deeply, and sometimes she'd give me money to buy candy from the little Mexican store down the street. I remember one day when my stepmother took my stepbrothers out somewhere, and my father was fixing his car. He got frustrated because he couldn't find a tool and started yelling at me. My grandma stopped him and scolded him, saying, "He's your only son. Why are you treating him this way?" My father stayed quiet and went back to working on the car. About a year later, my father told me to pack some clothes because my mother was coming to pick me up, to go camping with her church for a few days. When my mother and sisters arrived, I packed up and left with them. When I came back home, I told my grandma about the camping trip. I told her how much I liked the kids at the church, how kind they were, and how I had fun catching fish and tadpoles with them. As time went on, my stepbrothers started being mean to me. I think their mother told them to treat me that way. My father didn't do much about it. Sometimes he would buy McDonald's and give each of my stepbrothers a happy meal. But he'd share his meal with me, saying, "You're older, so you don't get a happy meal." Sometimes I'd cry quietly to my grandma in our room and fall asleep in her bed. It hurt when my father or stepmother lectured me, or only bought candy for their sons. When the ice cream truck came around the neighborhood, my stepbrothers would buy ice cream, but I didn't have any money. Once my grandma gave me a few dollars to buy ice cream, but later, my stepmother told my father that I had stolen money from them. I told them the truth, that my grandma had given it to me, and my father eventually stopped scolding me. Whenever my mother's church held events, they would come to pick me up. Eventually, I moved in with my mother, stepfather, and their family, and started going to church with them. They loved me as their own. Looking back, my childhood was both scary and heartwarming. I later learned that my grandma passed away during my first camping trip with my mother's church. I didn't understand how, even after her death, I still saw her in my room and cried to her. I think that's why, when she gave me money for ice cream, my father and stepmother thought it was stolen. Maybe she took the money from their room. I'll never know for sure. I remember my grandma being sick before I went camping. After the trip, I stayed at my mother's house for 2 more weeks. I now realize that during that time, they were holding my grandma's funeral. I love my grandma so much. I didn't know she was still watching over me even after she passed away. Story number 2. In 2007, my family moved into a house with a big backyard. It was an older house built in 1972. The previous owners were an elderly Asian couple. The wife was known for her ability to read palms and tell people's futures. Unfortunately, she got sick and passed away at the hospital one day. She didn't die in the house. At the time we moved in, I was only 17 years old and shared a room with my older brother, Chris. After living there for about 4 months, my dad told us we were going to do another house cleansing ritual. I thought we already did one when we first moved in. I don't know why my parents wants to do another one. Maybe they've experienced something unsettling in the house or something. One strange thing I noticed after we moved in was that every day when we came home from school, we would find my mom sitting outside watching movies on her little DVD player. 2 months later, my parents started looking for a new house again. It was strange. My brother Chris and I knew something had to be wrong with the old house, even though neither of us had seen anything unusual. On the day we moved out, we took almost everything important, but there were still some items and small pieces of furniture left behind. The following week, my dad told Chris and me to go straight to the old house after school to pick up the rest of the stuff. That day, Chris stayed after school to play basketball with his friends. He told me to go get the remaining things, and he'd meet me back home later. Since I had never seen anything strange in the old house, I wasn't scared. It was November, so by the time I arrived at the old house around 4 p.m., it was already getting dark. As I approached the house, I saw my mom standing at the door, and then she walked toward the backyard. I assumed my parents were already there and had parked their car in the garage. I followed my mom to the backyard, but once I got there, I didn't see her. Maybe she had gone inside through the sliding glass door. I walked up to the sliding door, but it was locked. I knocked on the glass a few times, but no one answered. After waiting for a couple of minutes, I decided to go back to the front door and use my key. When I stepped inside, I immediately saw someone standing at the end of the dark hallway. It was my mom, but she looked strange. The left side of her face was drooping. I said, "Mom, where's Dad?" She didn't respond. Instead, she started sobbing softly. I panicked. I quickly shut the door, leaving it unlocked, and ran back to the car. I drove straight to our new house. When I arrived, I saw my dad's car parked outside. I knew then that my parents hadn't been at the old house. When I walked in, my dad was watching TV and my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. I told my dad what happened at the old house and said, "I saw Mom there." He asked, "What did she look like?" I told him her mouth looked crooked and her face was drooping. That's when my dad admitted that he had been seeing my mom in strange places too, when we still lived at the old house. My dad told me that one morning he got up early for work, and as he backed his car out of the driveway, he saw my mom standing at the window, watching him. Her mouth looked crooked then too. When he came home later that day, he asked my mom if she had gotten up to watch him leave. She said no. She'd been asleep the whole time. He also explained that my mom had been terrified to stay inside the house when my dad was at work and we were at school. My dad said that the old house was strange. One morning, after my dad had already left for work, my mom was still in bed when she felt someone touching her hand. When she opened her eyes, she saw an old woman standing at the bedside, reading her palm. Panicking, my mom flipped the blanket over the woman, but when the blanket fell, there was no one there. Ever since that day, my mom refused to stay inside the old house alone. That's why we only lived there for 6 months. My parents didn't want to scare us kids by telling us the truth. 3 years later, in 2010, my mom had a stroke that left her mouth slightly crooked. She could still walk and take care of herself, but her speech became a little stiff. Now, when I think about it, maybe the ghost in that old house wasn't trying to scare us. When the old woman was alive, she was a palm reader who could see the future. Perhaps she was trying to warn us about what would happen to my mom. My dad and Grandpa believe my mom may have been possessed, but I think the ghost was just trying to tell us that my mom will have a stroke. Thank you for listening to my family story. Story number 3. My family used to live in a house on Juneau Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota. Juneau Avenue is an old street lined with big trees on both sides. During the daytime, the road is always shaded, but at night, it's very dark. Even our house felt kind of dark, even during the day. I remember one day when I was home with my mother because I wasn't feeling well. I was a 4th grader at the time. My mother and I were watching a movie together, and she was making me some tea with ginger to help with my coughing. I didn't like ginger, but my mother made me sit there with her until I finished drinking it. While I was sitting there, I noticed a shadow moving in the hallway, darting from room to room. I wasn't sure if my mother noticed it. She seemed so focused on the movie. Maybe she didn't see it, or maybe I was just imagining things. Then, I noticed her get up and turn on the hallway light, leaving it on. I couldn't finish the tea, and when my mother tried to make me drink it, I spat it out. She got mad and yelled at me to go to my room. Feeling upset, I went to my room, climbed into bed, and sulked for a while. After some time, I grabbed my coloring book and started coloring to distract myself. A little while later, I heard my mother calling my name. The voice sounded like it was coming from my parents' room. I got up, stepped out of my room, and looked around the living room, but my mother wasn't there. Then I heard her call my name again. It was coming from my parents' room. I walked into their room, and the whispering voice called my name again. It sounded like it was coming from under the bed. Curious, I got on my knees and looked underneath. There she was. Her black hair covered her face, and she was smiling at me. "Mommy, what are you doing under there?" I asked. Then I heard my mother's voice behind me. "Leslie, who are you talking to?" I turned and saw her standing in the hallway. My heart dropped. If my mother was standing there, then who was under the bed? "Mommy, there's a lady under your bed," I said. I saw my mother's expression change. She came into the room, knelt down, and looked under the bed with me, but there was nothing there. She hit me lightly on the head with her palm and scolded me for lying. My mother grabbed my hand, led me out of the room, and closed the door behind us. Then she said, "We're going to Grandma's house." We stayed at my grandparents' house until it was time to pick up my brother and sisters from school. That night, my mother told my father what had happened. My father brushed it off, saying I was just sick and imagining things. A few weeks later, something strange happened. One night, my parents were arguing in their bedroom with the door closed. I think it was because my father wanted to go out drinking with his friends on a Friday night, but my mother wouldn't let him. They were so upset with each other that my father ended up sleeping on the couch. The following week, we moved out of that house. At the time, I didn't understand why we moved, but later, when I was older, my older brother told me what really happened that night. While my father was sleeping on the couch, he woke up to the sound of someone closing a cabinet in the hallway. At first, he thought it was my mother. He looked over and, in the dim light from the TV, he saw a figure about my mother's height and size walking down the hallway. The figure was holding something in its hand and swinging it in circles. As it got closer to the kitchen and the living room, my father realized it wasn't my mother. The figure was holding its own long tongue in its right hand, swinging it like a rope. Terrified, my father got up and turned on the light, but when he looked around, there was no one there. That's why we moved. If my father hadn't experienced it himself, I don't think he would have believed me, or moved us out of that house. Story number 4. When I was going to school out of town, I went to live with my uncle and my grandparents in St. Paul. My grandparents didn't work, but they received SSI money, which allowed them to qualify for housing assistance and get a small house. During that time, my mother's younger brother Song was just 2 years older than me, and we were best friends. I had just graduated from high school and decided to attend the same college where Song was studying. When I arrived, Song had a small bed meant for one person. At night, he set up a spot for both of us to sleep on the floor. I told him it was fine for him to sleep in his bed while I stayed on the floor, but Song insisted. He said he didn't want to sleep in his bed because he often felt something sitting on him or having sleep paralysis, so some nights he would just sleep on the couch in the living room. Song was dating a girl at the time, so he often stayed up late talking to her on the phone in the living room before coming to sleep in the room with me. I remember one night in particular. Song was still up at 1 a.m., and I could hear my grandpa get up to use the bathroom. Afterward, I heard him telling Song not to stay up too late. A couple of minutes after my grandpa went back to bed, I heard the sound of a squeaky bed. At first I thought to myself how strong my grandpa still was. It sounded like he was really going at it with my grandma. The sound continued, but I was so tired that I eventually fell asleep. I could hear it clearly because our room was separated from my grandparents' room by just one wall. One Friday, my grandparents went out of town, and they wouldn't be back that night. I stayed behind because I had a biology lab class on Saturday. Song tried to convince me to skip class and go camping with him and his friends, but I didn't want to. I told him that if I finished my class early, I'd join them. That night, I was home alone. I slept on the floor instead of Song's bed because I knew he'd been with his girlfriend on that bed, and I didn't feel comfortable using it. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a squeaky bed. Half asleep, I thought to myself, why is the bed squeaking when my grandparents aren't even home? At that time, we didn't have cell phones yet, but I had a watch with a green light. I turned it on to check the time, and in the dim glow, I could make out the silhouette of something on Song's bed. It looked like a small figure, crouched like a dog, with messy curly hair bouncing on the bed. Terrified, I got up, ran to the door, and turned on the light. The figure quickly covered itself with a blanket. I panicked and bolted out of the house. It was only 4 a.m., and I was too scared to go back inside. I stayed outside until the sun came up around 7 a.m. When it was light out, I cautiously went back inside, but no one was there. I turned off the light, grabbed my keys, packed a few things, and drove to where Song and his friends were camping. When I told Song what had happened, he said it might have been because the bed wasn't brand new. They had bought it from the flea market. He said he often felt something sitting on him when he slept in that bed. Song decided we should get rid of it as soon as we got home. After our camping trip, Song and I threw the bed out onto the street. We figured someone would pick it up since people often drove around the neighborhood, collecting old furniture to fix and sell. Sure enough, after 4 days, someone took it. Song mentioned he was planning to get a bigger bed soon, since he would be getting married the next year. After Song got married, my grandparents split their room in half to give me a space to sleep. They used one of those blue plastic rugs as a divider. I wanted to sleep in the living room instead, but my grandparents wouldn't let me. One night, when my grandparents weren't home but Song and his wife were, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone jumping on my grandparents' bed. My grandparents' room had 2 windows, so it wasn't very dark. I peeked through the divider and saw a little girl jumping on their bed. I froze in fear and slowly went back to my side of the room, trying not to make any noise so she wouldn't notice me. I lay in bed, listening to the sound for about 20 minutes until it finally stopped. I never asked Song or his wife if they heard it too. After that night, I realized it wasn't just Song's old bed that was haunted. It was the house itself. I stayed with them until I finished college 4 years later, but I always dreaded staying in that house when my grandparents weren't home. On those nights, I would lie to Song, saying I was staying at a friend's house, but in reality, I'd sleep at a nearby Motel 6. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.